January 1963. A British diplomat named Kim Philby vanishes from Beirut. Weeks later, Moscow confirms what MI6 had spent 30 years refusing to believe. Their own former head of Soviet counterintelligence had been a Soviet agent since 1934. Most versions of this story call him a brilliant liar. He was. But that's not why he got away with it for 3 decades. He got away with it because the people investigating him couldn't imagine that someone like him, Cambridge educated, upper class, one of their own, could be the enemy. This isn't a story about a security failure. It's a story about what happens when an entire institution decides in advance who is capable of betrayal and who isn't. To understand how 5 Cambridge students became Soviet intelligence assets, you have to understand Cambridge in the early 1930s. The Depression was gutting Europe. Fascism was rising in Germany and in Spain. Democracies looked slow, compromised and out of answers. And for a certain kind of idealistic, well-connected undergraduate, communism didn't look like treason. It looked like the only serious response to a broken system. A system these same young men were being groomed to inherit and run. Several of them belonged to the same secretive Cambridge debating society, known as the Apostles, an intellectual club that had spent a century recruiting the university's most promising minds into a culture of absolute discretion. It was designed to produce men who kept secrets for each other instinctively. The Soviets didn't have to build that culture. They just had to find it already built and step inside. 5 men would eventually be named: Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, revealed decades after the rest, and never quite as famous. Soviet intelligence didn't recruit them as a group. It recruited them one at a time, then let the friendships do the rest. The man who understood how to use them was Arnold Deutsch, a Soviet talent scout working out of London. His theory was simple, and it turned out to be devastatingly correct. Don't recruit spies who look like spies. Recruit the men who will one day run the institutions you want to penetrate. Tell them the wait might be a decade or more, and let their own careers do the infiltrating for you. Patience, not tradecraft, was the real weapon. This matters because it separates the Cambridge 5 from almost every spy stereotype that came after them. They weren't paid mercenaries selling secrets for money. They believed, at least at first, that they were on the right side of history. That conviction is what let them lie to friends, colleagues, and eventually entire governments for 30 years without visible strain. Philby was the most patient of them all. He didn't rush towards sensitive work. He built an ordinary, respectable career first, as a journalist, then as a war correspondent covering the Spanish Civil War for the Times. By the time the Second World War broke out, nobody was questioning his politics anymore. He'd spent years making sure of that, one unremarkable career step at a time. In 1940, Philby was recruited into Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6. Within a few years, he was running Section 9, the department responsible for counter-Soviet operations. Read that again. The man tasked with catching Soviet spies inside Britain was himself a Soviet spy. Every operation his section ran against Moscow, Moscow already knew about before it started. Part of how he got there was a colleague named Nicholas Elliott, a close friend inside MI6 who considered Philby practically a brother. Elliott would later vouch for Philby not once, but twice, when suspicion started to circle. It wasn't naivety. It was exactly the kind of loyalty the institution had trained its own officers to feel toward each other. While Philby climbed inside MI6, the others found their own footholds. Donald Maclean rose through the Foreign Office, eventually gaining access to the most sensitive diplomatic cables passing between London and Washington. Anthony Blunt served in wartime intelligence, then became a trusted art historian to the royal household itself, a position that placed him, quite literally, inside Buckingham Palace. Guy Burgess drifted between the BBC, the Foreign Office, and MI6's own propaganda arm. Charming, reckless, and somehow protected by his connections at every turn. John Cairncross worked at Bletchley Park, Britain's code-breaking centre, where he fed Soviet intelligence details from decrypted German communications, including intelligence that may have helped the Red Army prepare for the Battle of Kursk in 1943. This is the part most telling skip. British intelligence in this era ran almost entirely on personal trust. Old-school ties, family reputation, the right accent in the right room. Formal background investigations barely existed. If you'd been to the right college and knew the right people, you were vetted by reputation alone. The Cambridge Five didn't break that system. They were precisely what it was built to trust without question. There was, at this point, no formal process resembling what intelligence agencies now call positive vetting. No systematic check of a candidate's associations, finances, or foreign contacts. That entire discipline didn't exist yet. The Cambridge Five are, in a very real sense, the reason it does now. By 1951, American codebreakers working on a Soviet cable decryption project called Venona had narrowed a years-old leak down to the British Foreign Office. Donald Maclean was named as a suspect. He had days, perhaps only hours, before he'd be formally questioned, and everyone in the small circle of Cambridge friends knew it. On May 25, 1951, Maclean and Guy Burgess vanished from Britain together, boarding a ferry to France under false names. They wouldn't resurface publicly for years, and when they finally did, it was in Moscow. Their disappearance confirmed what British intelligence had spent months refusing to seriously entertain. The network was real, and it went deeper than anyone in power wanted to admit. The disappearance triggered a public sensation. Journalists and MPs spent years chasing the idea of a single, mysterious, third man who had tipped off Maclean before his exposure. The press treated it almost like a parlour game. Nobody in public was yet willing to imagine that the real number wasn't 3. It was 5. Philby was questioned. Some colleagues suspected him outright. But the same culture that let him rise now protected him. The idea that a man of his background and service record could be a Soviet mole was, to many of his peers, simply unthinkable. Nicholas Elliot vouched for him again. Philby was quietly pushed out of MI6 in 1951, but never formally charged. He spent the next decade in Beirut as a journalist, still, officially, above suspicion. In 1964, Anthony Blunt privately confessed to British intelligence in exchange for immunity from prosecution. He kept his royal position, his knighthood, and his public reputation, all while officials sat on the truth for 15 more years. The same establishment that had recruited him also shielded him, right up until a journalist finally forced the story into public view in 1979. By January 1963, fresh evidence was finally closing in on Philby too. Confronted directly, he stalled for time in Beirut, then vanished, resurfacing in Moscow weeks later. He lived there until his death in 1988, decorated by the KGB as one of the most effective agents it ever ran. John Cairncross was never publicly confirmed as the fifth man until 1990, almost 4 decades after Burgess and Maclean fled. He'd spent those decades living an ordinary life, mostly forgotten, while the other 4 became legend. In some ways, that made him the most successful of them all. The case reshaped how Western intelligence services thought about trust itself. Positive vetting, the practice of formally checking a person's background, associations, and vulnerabilities before granting them access to secrets, became standard policy, largely because of what these 5 men proved was possible without it. The lesson was never that they were unusually gifted deceivers. It's that any system which grants automatic trust based on class, education, or pedigree isn't security. It's a blind spot with a good tailor. Modern vetting exists because Britain learned, at enormous cost, that the most dangerous spy is the one nobody thinks to check.